Where is your wilderness? The closest I've ever come to true wilderness was on the Kingcome-Gwaii River in BC. I visited the Kingcome village on the river, home of the Tsawwassen First Nation. In 2010, a massive flood on the river destroyed much of the village. And in the summer of 2011, I went there as part of a Mennonite disaster service team helping to rebuild houses in the village. To get there from Vancouver, we took a ferry to Nanaimo, a 4-hour drive to Port Hardy in the north, a much smaller ferry to a tiny dock at the mouth of the river, and then an 1.5-hour ride up the river in a 15-person hand-carved dugout canoe powered by a 120-horsepower outboard motor. It was quite the trip. It was beautiful there in Kingcome, and so isolated. That trip by boat up the river was the only way in and out of the village, for groceries, for building supplies, everything. One afternoon, our crew leader gave us time to go off in that canoe another hour up the river to this amazing waterfall. It was paradise, true wilderness, and so far from any kind of what we settlers call civilization. I was very careful using my power tools that week. That's the setting that comes to mind when I think of a natural wilderness. What about you? I know this sounds like an ad for an SUV, but I think it's a meaningful question. As Tom mentioned already, we're using the theme Wild Church for our summer worship with these materials provided through Mennonite Church Canada. The materials were gathered by 6 different wild church groups that meet regularly outdoors for worship and reflection. One of those is the MC Sask Forest Church that meets at Camp Shekinah on the first Sunday afternoon of the month, which, hey, that is today, 3 p.m. Summertime vibes meet peaceful reflection in outdoor worship. Come check it out. 3 o'clock today, don't forget your bug spray. So when we think of wilderness, we are usually thinking about the great outdoors, nature, mountains, rocks, trees, rivers, or sand and wind and nothing else, just some sunshine. Like that SUV commercial, for almost all of us here in a suburban Saskatoon church this morning, wilderness is a chosen experience. When I decide to spend a few days in the great outdoors, I have a carefully curated selection of camping gear to keep me warm and dry and well-fed. I signed up for that canoe trip up the Kingcome-Gwaii River in BC, made the arrangements months in advance. Last month, I chose to lead/drag my children along the trail to the sand dunes in Douglas Provincial Park in 30-degree heat. And when it got even hotter at our campsite there the next day, I chose to pack up early and spend the last day of our camping trip in Moose Jaw at the hotel. I did bring the rest of the family with me, too. Wilderness is optional for me. There's a hotel somewhere close by, at least the literal natural kind of wilderness. If I don't want to go there, I don't have to. When we were leaving the parking lot at the Sand Dunes trailhead, a guy in a silk Hawaiian shirt and designer sunglasses pulled up in a fancy SUV and stopped to ask us if there was an air-conditioned visitor center or restaurant at the end of the trail. I know. I laughed in his face. This is 6 kilometers of sand and dirt and a few trees, and then you get to the sand dunes. This is middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan. And I did laugh at him, but it's not an unreasonable expectation these days. So many of our natural wonders have all the amenities a few steps away, along with plenty of oversized RV parking spaces in the gift shop parking lot. We are tame people. We are indoors people, most of us. Even the rugged SUV we might take on that wilderness adventure comes equipped, obviously, with carefully calibrated systems of climate control. Not pointing any fingers. Going from the blazing hot campsite to the AC in the hotel swimming pool was such a good call. Indoors, or even better, indoors and online, that is my jam. And yet, there is a cost to all of this. All that climate control does something to us. It creates an illusion of control that is rather unsustainable. The wilderness, actual wildness, is decidedly out of our control. The challenge of the biblical story, though, is that this may actually be a blessing rather than a curse. You knew this story of Moses before we heard it again today. Moses was born to a family of Hebrew slaves, hidden in a basket in the river, rescued and claimed by the daughter of Pharaoh. Moses had been raised in his Hebrew family, but he was also claimed as son by Pharaoh's daughter. So, afoot in both worlds, he was perfectly positioned to help his Hebrew people. He had a title, he had access to power, he had a destiny. He was the prince of Egypt. But Moses failed to live up to that high calling. The tension of his dual identity, Egyptian yet Hebrew, a prince and a slave, that was unresolvable. He tried to walk the line. When he saw one of his Hebrew brothers being abused, he defended him and killed the Egyptian slave master. And then, as Marnie pointed out, he realized just how poorly that would go over in his Egyptian palace. And so he hid the body. Of course, his crime was quickly discovered, and the lowly Hebrews rejected him because they were afraid of him. They feared his power, and the mighty Egyptians rejected him because he had used that power against them. Too much heat. Climate decidedly out of control. So Moses hit the eject button and ran away to hide in the wilderness. The region of Midian, literally translated the land of strife. And things got better there, sort of. Moses found some peace in the land of strife. He did meet a woman and started a family. And when their first son was born, Moses named him Gershom, meaning outcast. Thanks, Dad. Yeah, Moses was still a little bitter. So there we have Moses at rock bottom, father of outcast, living in the land of strife, tending the flocks of the leftovers. That was his father-in-law's name, Yethro, meaning the remainder, the leftovers. So started at the top, now we here, outcast, serving leftovers in the land of strife. That is the wilderness of the burning bush. Harsh, chaos, struggle, truly wild. 1.5 stars would not recommend. And it's in this place that God shows up for Moses. I love the image of the burning bush, on fire but not consumed. Our worship materials point out that in the Sinai Peninsula, it was not unusual for a bush to catch fire from the desert heat. It was that hot, and yes, it was a dry heat. But a burning bush was not that much of an unusual thing for a desert shepherd to come across. What was unique was that this bush burned without being consumed, without shriveling up, without being lost to the flames. I imagine that Moses may have felt like that bush, out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. His whole life, his identity, his security, his future, all of that had been set on fire. It had burned away. So why am I here? What's the point? Said the outcast in the land of strife. And out of that fire, God speaks, "Take off your sandals, for this is holy ground." You see wilderness, you see strife, you see the flame of what might have been, but I see what endures. I see what truly is underneath. I see being, existence, that which persists through the chaos, through the flames. Out of the flames, God speaks the name Moses, drawn out. The baby in the river was given that name by Pharaoh's daughter because she drew him out of the water. But here too, perhaps, Moses has been drawn out, called out. It feels to him like he has been cast out, but no, God has drawn him here, into the strife, to the flame for a purpose. And I am paraphrasing a bit, connecting some dots that may or may not be in the text itself. This is an enigmatic, ambiguous text, especially the bit that comes next. Having been reminded of his own name, Moses now asks God, "What is your name? How do I know who you are?" I am that I am. Riddle for the ages, that one. I am being itself is one interpretation. Existence, the ground of being, the sum of all plus one, of all that exists. Or, I am who I will be, some translations say, a sense that you will know who God is by paying attention to what God does. You want to know who I am? Follow me, stay with me, you'll see. Another translation emphasizes the context of the Hebrews feeling abandoned in their slavery. To them, Moses is to say that God is, I am here, I am present, I am the God who is near. Today, as I've been talking about this burning bush that is burned out and yet somehow not burned up, I wonder if the I am is about the infinite dimension underneath everything. I am that which endures, that which remains, that which continues to be, beyond the end as we know it, I am. I don't know exactly. It's rather beyond words, which is kind of the point. My point is that when we go into the wilderness, especially when we are drawn there not by our own choosing, when we expect to find disaster, we may just find sacred fire, holy ground. Where I am undone, that may be where God is. That was Moses' story. All that power he thought he had in Egypt, it did nothing for him or his people. It just made the mess deeper for all of them. Coming to the land of strife, outcast, burned out, and vulnerable, that was when Moses was finally ready to pay attention to God. And surprisingly, in that surrender, Moses was able to receive the meaning and purpose and belonging that he had been searching for all along. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The wilderness is the place of transformation. You know the rest of the story. Moses follows the call to go back to Egypt as the spokesperson for God's anti-slavery campaign. And long story short, the hand of God succeeds where the hand of Moses could not. God leads the Hebrews out of Egypt through the Red Sea, and they all lived happily ever after. Not so much. Moses leads them on the same journey that he had just been on. Out of Egypt, yes, and straight into Midian, the land of strife. They had to meet God in the wilderness as well. This journey is for everyone. I see two things going on here when we're talking about wild church and finding God in the wilderness. One is that God speaks in and through the natural world. If we slow down and pay attention, we will indeed find that burning bushes are everywhere in the wilderness. To practice wild church, especially for those of us in suburbia, is to learn how to look for those natural connections, to make a point of choosing wilderness so that we don't miss out on the burning bushes. At the same time, with Moses, we must realize that sometimes, most times, wilderness is not a choice. Wilderness finds us, especially metaphorically. And so wild church means learning to trust that God speaks just as much in the wilderness that is forced upon us, that we, like the bush, can feel that fire without being consumed by it. Not that I wish that on anyone. It's just that I know that's where some of us are living these days, this weekend. Wild church is an invitation to step into the wildness of the natural world with intention as we are able, to let that wild world be a teacher that helps us to prepare for and deal with the wildness that comes to us, in which we live and move and have our being. I discovered a new teacher this week, a professor who has grounded his life in this intersection between the natural world and civilized society. Belden Lane is his name, a Presbyterian theologian and professor of theological studies at St. Louis University in the States. Among other things, he has written this book called Backpacking with the Saints, Wilderness Hiking as Spiritual Practice. As you would expect from that title, Belden has spent a lot of time alone in the literal wilderness, as well as journeying through the metaphorical wilderness of grief and doubt. We're going to listen to a clip of Belden Lane on the Holy Heretics podcast, telling a story about why the wilderness is a necessary place for spiritual formation. Let's listen. is the same everywhere, but I am not. That is good. That's a profound reason to choose the wilderness, both natural and metaphorical, when we have that option. There is something about me that is different out there than in here. And that's also true when the wilderness chooses me, like it or not. Moses did not, could not, would not hear God in the halls of power in Egypt. He had to be outcast. He had to journey to the land of strife to be able to meet God. Let me be clear, I do not believe that God sends us into the wilderness or causes the wilderness to crash down around us in order to speak to us or teach us. God doesn't do this to us. Wilderness happens because that is the way of life. That is the nature of the universe. You can fault God for making it that way or not, but that's a topic of conversation for another day. For today, it's enough for me to say that wilderness happens because that's what it is to be human. The land of strife, that's where we all live. We cannot opt out of that. That truth is made clear when we encounter the natural world. Belden Lane again. When we look at nature, we can't pick and choose, reckoning only with daisies and lovable black labs. Nature at its nicest. The entirety of a wild and wondrous world confronts us out there, both predator and prey. Our faith does not remove us from this circle of life and death. We are both predator and prey, powerful and vulnerable. Climate control is a delightful illusion. What we can do is to trust that there are burning bushes in every wilderness, and as Belden Lane has found, that the wilderness experience uniquely positions us to be able to see and respond to them. The spiritual life involves risk. There's no way around it. The paradox of biblical religion is that God cannot be understood, much less managed. Coming to terms with ultimate mystery is always dangerous. But to our amazement, encountering the holy can also mean being strangely and unaccountably loved. So, who's up for a journey into the wilderness? I heard recently that some Wildwood women went on a canoe trip up north in Mississippi. Sounded like something that more of us could stand to do sometime. Talk to Wendy, she knows some people. Saskatchewan is full of true wilderness for those of us who go looking for it. And I know not all of us are equipped for an extreme adventure. The good news is that the natural dangers of the ultimate mystery are still right across the street, even in my backyard, full of wasps and mosquitoes and thorny raspberry bushes. Wherever you find yourself, my prayer for you this week is that you will encounter just slightly more wilderness than you are prepared to handle. And that in those burning bushes, you will discover again that you do have what you need and that you are strangely and unaccountably loved. Amen.